this is part of a series of lectures and conversations that we've initiated over this year as we try to expand the visibility of religious studies on campus and within the state of Oregon, actually. And we had Amy Collinger, my colleague, and myself had a delightful visit with the faculty, religious studies faculty at Lewis and Clark College in, when was that? October, it must have been.
Yeah.
Okay, early October, and just very fascinating in terms of some of the activities and interests of faculty in Lewis and Clark, Linfield, Willamette, and also some interesting connections with our faculty here at OSU. So one of the fruits of that particular conversation was to invite Susanna Morrill as our speaker this evening. And Susanna is the chair of the Department of Religious Studies at Lewis and Clark. She did her doctoral work at the University of Chicago, and much of her doctoral research focused on women in the LDS or Mormon community, and she's going to talk a little bit about that this evening, that particular topic. And see the title there. I have a mother there, and I'm sure Susanna will mention this, but in growing up in LDS congregation as I did, one of the songs that one of the hymns we used to sing very, very frequently was one of the few, frankly, that have been authored by a woman by the name of Eliza R. And I think this is right. I'm not going to sing this. But the third verse of this begins, or ends, I think. In the heavens, our parents single. No, the thought makes reason stare. Truth is reason, truth eternal tells me I've a mother there. And so it's that kind of, if you will, unofficial, but at least sanctioned through the hymnal concept that leads members of the Latter-day Saint community to at least think they have a mother in heaven in addition to a father in heaven. And so that's what Susanna is going to enlighten us on this evening. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Can everybody hear me in the back? Yeah. If I start going below my classroom voice, let me know in the back room. But thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here, and really glad that we're starting to make connections between institutions. I think it's a really great thing, and I hope we're able to, get some energy and synergy going. So I look forward to that. And I actually have that hymn. We'll look at that hymn.
Okay.
It's pretty cool.
Sing it?
I will not sing it.
Oh, okay.
There's no way I'm going to sing it. But we will look at the text. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about how Mormon women from the late 19th to early 20th century, how Mormon women writers, in their work, in their poetry, in their short stories, in their talks, in their private journals, how their understanding of the Mother in Heaven, how the portrait they developed of the Mother in Heaven has shaped how today the Mother in Heaven is presented in what you might call sort of official publications of the Mormon Church. And here I'm going to look at Ensign, which is the church magazine, basically, right? So we're going to look at how that happens, how women, earlier women, have shaped today's church. I'm going to start with this picture. So this is a picture of the general authorities of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which I'll also call the LDS Church and the Mormon Church. And I start with this photo because this is how oftentimes outsiders especially will think of the Mormon Church, right, as a very patriarchal and hierarchical authoritarian church. Yeah, that's often the picture that people have in their mind. And there certainly is some truth to that, right? But there's a lot of other stuff going on. There's a lot of other more complicated forces at work, I guess you could say. And that's true of any religious community, not just of the Mormon Church, but of any religious community. And as you probably know, those of you who are in the field of religious studies, a lot of the direction in the field today is to try to get below that institutional level, right? To get to that stuff that's going on beneath the surface, so to speak, that's driving what's going on at the surface a lot of times. This is especially important in terms of women in American religion. Historian Ann Braudy has talked about has shown how women have been the majority of church members in American religious history pretty much across the board, pretty much from the start, right? So they've been the ones who have given the money to the churches. They've been the ones that have provided the woman power to run the churches, really creating the foundation for these institutions, but not within the institutional structures themselves, right? So we haven't been able to track what's going on with women. So there's been a real push in the field to try to get below the surface, to try to use more lived religious approaches versus institutional religious approaches. So that's what I'm going to try to do today with this more focused case study. This is a rundown of my argument. It's right there. What I'm going to argue is that women writers developed this portrait of the Mother in Heaven as a female figure who stood literally at the gates of mortality and sent off her spirit children to mortality and then welcomed them back into the spirit world upon their death. Right? And this was a portrait that was developed from this hymn by Eliza R. Women writers took this hymn as a template and then enlarged on it, expanded on it, riffed on it, and developed this more detailed portrait. And that we see that idea showing up in today's, again, sort of official pronouncements of the Mother in Heaven, official descriptions of the Mother in Heaven. Along the way, what I want to do, though, is also speak to larger issues within the field of religious studies. And one of the ways I want to do this is to use these categories that Catherine Breckus, who's a historian of American religion, who focuses on women in particular, she's sort of issued these challenges to us as we are trying to include women in narratives of American religious history. How do we do this? Yeah. How do we see them? How do we see women as agents? How do we see women as actors? How do we see women as forces which have shaped religious communities? Catherine Breckus suggests that we need to get away from the idea that we have to see actors, historical agents, as people who are trying to liberate themselves, right? People who are kind of acting against structures, especially when we're talking about religious groups that are maybe more socially conservative, like Mormonism, more patriarchal on the surface than Mormonism. So Catherine Breckus has spoken directly to actually Mormon studies. This is from a lecture that she gave to scholars of Mormonism, where she was sort of exhorting us to include women in narratives of Mormon history. And she was suggesting, well, this is some of the ways that we can do this. These are some of the ways that we can talk about agency, see agency. So along the way, I'm going to make the argument that we can see women as agents through these, well, what are they, 9 categories. Yeah. So that we need to, Breckus says, we need to rethink the close association between agency and intentionality. So these women weren't necessarily out to change their community. They weren't out to create this portrait of the Mother in Heaven. It just sort of happened as they were having this kind of communal conversation. She talks about agency should be seen as relational and social rather than simply individual, that agency can be collective, that individuals gain agency because a community of some kind supports them, right? So that we need to look more to the collective rather than the individual when we're talking, especially about women and women as agents. Agency is not an either-or proposition. Different groups of people have different degrees of agency. the last three I think are really important. The agency is always shaped by cultural norms and structural constraints. The agency includes reproduction of social structures as well as the transformation of them. And agency takes place within structures as well as against them, right? So that these women are working within these structures and, again, not necessarily challenging them, but along the way in their collective work, changing them. I hope I'll be able to convince you of this from this as we go along in this particular case study. Okay, so we have these categories I want to argue that we can see illustrated by this case study, but I also want to add to this. With this case study, I think we also can make the argument that agency is not something that's evolutionary, right? It's not something that, in this case, women get more and more of, right? It's actually you could almost argue it's the opposite in this case. So I want us to move away from evolutionary models of historical interpretation, sort of post-millennial, if that has any meaning for you, post-millennial evolutionary models of agency. The agency exists on a continuum. It's dynamic over time. And it expresses itself differently in institutional, ritual, theological, social arenas of life. So as a consequence, as scholars, we really need to be sensitive to this, to notice how agency shifts, and methodologically light on our feet as well. Shift our methods as we see that agency changing. So in this case study, for instance, I'm going to be using my methodology. It's going to be Weberian, and I'll talk more about what that is. And also this more lived religious approach. But it's going to be more Weberian in the earlier part, more lived religion in the later part, right, as I'm trying to shift and pick up women as agents. So I'm also going to make that case, that we need to move away from evolutionary models and be really sensitive to how agency shifts, and shift in response our methodology and our interpretive models. Okay, so that's the plan. Any questions right off the bat? If you have any questions along the way, just jump in. Any clarifications, that sort of thing. Okay, so let's get into the material, because it's really great stuff. So a little bit about the history of the Mother in Heaven and the history of this hymn, and Eliza R. Snow, who wrote this hymn. Joseph Smith apparently revealed the doctrine of the Mother in Heaven during the Nauvoo era of the church. So this is in 1840s in Illinois, when the church is just before the move to Utah. However, the first extended public discussion of the Mother in Heaven was Eliza Snow's poem. It was originally a poem, which is called "O My Father." And it was published in 1844 in the Nauvoo Mormon newspaper. That was just sort of the local newspaper. By 1851, it was set to music as a hymn. Now, church leaders said very little about the Mother in Heaven publicly, and in fact, it wasn't until 1909 that you get an official pronouncement by a church leader, published in an official publication of a church, which mentions the Mother in Heaven, which says we have a mother and a father. We have heavenly parents. Yeah. So as a result, you can imagine it's the hymn, right, that really is the de facto statement of the Mother in Heaven. This is sort of the definitive description of this divine figure. Because of Snow's institutional religious authority and prestige, her hymn had great influence on how the doctrine of the Mother in Heaven developed. And this is a picture of Eliza R. Snow. I actually had to do two pictures because that dress is just so great, right? So she's really, really important. She joined the church in 1835, just 5 years after the founding of the church. The church was founded officially in 1830. She joins in 1835, so very early on. And she really quickly moved to the inner circle of the church. She became one of Joseph Smith's, Joseph Smith is the founder of Mormonism. She became one of his plural wives in 1842, and following his death in 1844, she then became the plural wife of Brigham Young, who was the second church president, right? She gradually became the most important female institutional leader in the church, probably the most powerful woman in the church, in the entire history of the church, right? However, and this is really key to why she was institutionally so powerful, Snow was really publicly and resolutely obedient to the male leadership of the church, and she regularly encouraged members of the Relief Society, which is the women's auxiliary of the Mormon Church. She regularly encouraged members to follow directives of priesthood leaders, to follow the male leaders' directives. So again, this is no doubt one of the reasons why she was able to gain institutional authority, along with her close connections to the highest leadership of the church. After the LDS community moved to Utah, after Illinois, Snow was named president of the Relief Society. Snow headed up what historian Maureen Orsenbach Beecher has called an inner echelon of first-generation women converts with very close ties to church leaders. This group of women were really powerful. They ran their own affairs and wielded great institutional authority over women of the church. Due to their influence in the sort of at the latter part of the 19th century, the Relief Society had a really powerful and really semi-independent existence within the church. They raised their own funds, they managed their own money, they had their own publication, they had this extensive system of meeting houses and grain storage that they had funded and managed themselves. They were very much seen as a kind of parallel to the male priesthood structures, much more than they are today, right? Where the Relief Society is very clearly an auxiliary of the church. Here they were sort of a parallel female institutional structure, if that makes sense. I think this is important, that Snow's institutional authority, in turn, rested partly on her charismatic authority. She was called a prophetess at the time period. Into the 20th century, Snow's hymn was considered to be an authoritative revelatory statement on Mormon theology. It was called a revelation by church members and by church leaders as well. This thus cemented her charismatic authority among Mormon women and Mormon men. And I should say, you guys probably know, in Mormonism, right, church members are expected to have this kind of revelatory prophetic authority themselves for their own sort of personal lives, right? So there's a precedent for this kind of charismatic prophetic authority on the personal level and then moving up to the leadership level. And she was really taking advantage of this. So let's take a look at the text of this hymn. Professor Campbell already kind of called out the most important.
Let me turn on the lights.
Oh, yeah. I'll get it for you. The most important verse, which is the third verse, where she has this revelation. I have a mother, right? I have a heavenly mother. And you can see, to me, this hymn is a great, very clear description of the LDS plan of salvation. This idea that you have a mother and father God in the pre-existence, right? They have these spirit children. And for the spirit children to move on, to progress spiritually, they have to go into mortality. They have to live their lives, make the right decisions, use their free will, and then go back to the spirit world and meet with their heavenly parents. Eventually, there's this idea at this time period that you would go on and start this process in another world, right? That eventually you yourself could become divine. So I like this hymn because it talks about the mother in heaven, but I think it also very clearly, clearly spells out that plan of salvation. And you can see here, just one more thing that I would add here, that the fall in Mormonism is a fortunate fall, right? That Adam and Eve give human beings this free will, which is such a necessary part of this plan of salvation. Okay, so this hymn was really popular was often called the Grant Invocation. And in my sources, what I saw is that it became a kind of Lord's Prayer. It was a hymn that was used to open just about every kind of gathering, from a surprise birthday party, right, just at your friend's house, to this twice yearly general conference, which is where all those general authorities were sitting at, that first picture. So it was incredible. It's hard for me to express how popular it was, how ubiquitous it was. So, though church leaders rarely talked at length about the Mother in Heaven, this divinity was ever present in the ritual life of the church members during this early time period. Every time they sang this hymn, church members were reminded of the Mother in Heaven, and also, I think really importantly, they were reminded of Snow's charismatic authority and her close connection with Joseph Smith and with Brigham Young, right, with that kind of prophetic tie that she had. Members of the church communally spoke divine words. They bodily participated in a revelation. And this is really unusual because most of the other revelation in the Mormon church was in Scripture, right? Was in the Book of Mormon or was in Doctrine and Covenant. But here, they were reciting it themselves. They were participating in it themselves. So here's a great example of somebody expressing this idea of kind of ritual engagement with this hymn. This was a poetic tribute for Snow's 80th birthday party in 1884. And here the poet rhapsodizes about the hymn's experiential dimensions. So she writes, "How shall we e'er forget that hymn of praise, familiar to the saints of latter days? Even, O my Father, the exalting strain uplifts the spirit into heaven again, and makes us recollect our royal birth, however humble is our lot on earth." Right, so just the hymn itself is she's saying, is sparking for her this moment, this memory, where she is coming into contact with that forgotten divine past, primeval past. Yeah. The experience of the singing the hymn assured this poet of the ultimate heavenly reunion by giving her an experiential taste of that reunion. When she sang the hymn, the reality of the Mother in Heaven, as described by Snow, was affirmed for this poet. Snow's authority, just to kind of sum up here, Snow and this hymn. Snow's authority rested on the confidence of many men and women, right? So here's that collective aspect of agency. How did she gain her authority? It was because these men and women had faith in her. Snow was powerful because of her organizational ability, sort of like Brigham Young. If you know about Brigham Young, he was a great organizer, and I think she was like that as well. She was powerful because of her marital ties to Smith and to Young, because of her overt obedience to church leaders, and that she stuck with cultural expectations about what a woman leader would act like. She was authoritative because of her prophetic voice, and because she gave church members a ritual embodied experience of the ultimate eternal goal of Mormonism. They bodily experienced her authority in that moment of singing. Yeah, so for all of these multiple layered reasons, she develops this hybrid sort of institutional charismatic authority, which in turn lifts this hymn up as being really central to the conversation, to the public and ritual conversation in this community. Okay, so that's the hymn, right? And this is the background of Eliza R. Snow. Now let's look at how women then sort of play with this hymn. Again, they sort of riff on it. The literary development of the Mother in Heaven was as much a collective product as a product of Snow's imagination. Snow's respected leadership authority allowed women individually and as a group to explore and expand the portrait of the Mother in Heaven in the public discourse of the community. These women writers were doing a variation of what literary scholar Barbara Newman has called imaginative theology. Newman argues that, in her case, medieval women engaged in imaginative theology when they explored and shaped Catholic theology by means of literature and images. Their work was not sanctioned by the church, but it was influenced by inherited religious and cultural patterns. So here we have this idea of cultural norms and women working within sort of established cultural norms and expectations. Showing up here again. Because Snow's hymn was the major source through which church leaders and members had access to the Mother in Heaven, and because it carried with it Snow's authority, writers used it as a template with which to explore the Mother in Heaven. This was a structure that they expanded and filled in. Specifically, they more fully developed the idea of the Mother in Heaven as standing at the gates of mortality, sending off and then welcoming her children to the divine realm. And perhaps the clearest example of this, Emily Hill Woodmansey, who's a really famous Mormon poet of this era, she pulls phrases directly from the hymn when she's talking about the Mother in Heaven, right? So this is a really clear example of how these Mormon women poets were looking to this hymn as an authoritative source on which to then build. So she says, free from this so the quotes are coming directly from the hymn. I guess you guys can figure that out. And these quotes were in the actual original poem. She says, free from this most frail existence, free to lay this mortal by, free to span the starry distance, to the royal courts on high. Ransom spirit, deathless essence, hie thee hence to realms so fair, gain thy Father's radiant presence, greet thy noble mother there. So here, Woodmansey emphasizes her friend's reception into the heavenly realm, the moment that Snow spells out so clearly in her own hymn, right? So she's taking this idea and just starting to play with it a little bit. But again, in a really direct way with these quotes, yeah? Things got a little more sort of attenuated. Women sort of play with this in more indirect fashion. We can look at this in another poem, really interesting one. The Mother in Heaven takes on a much more active and central role in a poem recorded by Jane Karchner Morris. This was a poem that was recorded in her journal probably in the early to mid 20th century, and it's actually a redaction of a poem by this guy William C. Harrison, who had published it in another or a different church periodical, the Improvement Era, which was a periodical of this time period. So she's taking Harrison's poem and she's kind of reworking it. This is Oh My Mother. This becomes Oh My Mother. And it is retooling that hymn to focus just on the Mother in Heaven. Here, not surprisingly, given what we know, the Mother in Heaven sends off her daughters with affection and warning. So she writes, O my mother, thou that dwellest in your mansions up on high, how you pressed me to your bosom, bade me a true child to be, ere I left my home eternal, to accept mortality. Right, so the Mother in Heaven now is taking a much more active role. She's saying, right, she's saying, you need to go and, do these things to be good and to come back to me. Right, she's directing, much more directing. The poem finishes with the speaker begging the Father and Mother gods to welcome her back to the spirit world upon her death, ending with the specific request that, dearest Mother, to your bosom, please welcome back this one. Right, so that gives a very visual, graphic image of the Mother in Heaven and welcoming the child back into the heavenly realm. Yeah, so we're starting to develop this image in more detail. A logical extension of Snow's less detailed scenes of departure and return, the Mother in Heaven is the last to bid her children goodbye and the first to greet them on their return. She is a divine figure who helps humans transition between the different, what are called estates, right, from the preexistence to mortality back to a divine kind of existence. These are really key moments in the plan of salvation. Right, that as you're making these transitions, really important moments, right? So she's a sort of stabilizing figure in a way, somebody who's stabilizing those difficult, potentially dangerous times. Okay, and then just one more example of this expansion. This is actually a story, and it was published in. Sorry, I don't have any quotes on this one. But it was published in 1916 in the Relief Society magazine. The author is Laura Munch Jenkins, and she goes into much more detail in describing the Mother in Heaven as standing at the gates of mortality. At the beginning of the story, the mother in heaven meets with two daughters who've been selected by God the Father to enter mortality and thus to start in earnest the process of salvation. She gives to each of them a gift that they choose. So she gives them integrity and love. To another, she gives them the gift of music. And then she sends them off with their guardian angels from the gates of heaven to make the journey to earth. And this is a literal image of her standing at the gates and sending them away. One of the daughters finds a happy home on earth. The other spirit child is left without a body in which to continue her spiritual journey when her earthly mother has an abortion. Upon her arrival in the spirit world, she's greeted by an astonished mother in heaven. The story ends here, leaving the reader with a vision of a beautiful, divine female standing again at these literal portals between heaven and earth. Yeah, and that's sort of the most detailed description of the mother in heaven that I came across in these sources. Significantly, Jenkins and Morris's portraits mirror and reverse the work that Mormon women performed at birthbeds and deathbeds of their friends and neighbors as they helped to bring newborns into the world, and were also the last to care for the sick and dying. Women were organized in the Relief Society on the ward, which is basically the parish level, right? So on the neighborhood level, they were organized to go and to help their neighbors in these moments of great emotional tension, but also, again, of spiritual, of almost sort of spiritual danger, right? These moments of transition. There develops this really interesting, it's not something that is institutionally spelled out, but it becomes a sort of lived religious pattern of sort of practice, ritual around birth and death. Especially around death, there are certain things that women do. They wash the body, they dress the body, they lay out the body, they sit with the body, right? There's certain, again, sort of ritualized practices that are developed during this time period. So you can see what's going on here, or I'm making the argument you can see what's going on here, right? That they're mirroring what the Mother in Heaven is doing in this sort of ritualized, lived religious practice. The Mother in Heaven sends off her children to mortality. These Relief Society women welcome that spirit into mortality. When that mortal spirit departs, the Relief Society women sort of ease that transition, and the Mother in Heaven then welcomes back. Right? So it's women standing at these moments in both cases. So this is another case where the embodied, ritualized practices of the community are reinforcing this hymn and expanding this hymn. Women writers shaped the template of Snow's hymn to make sense within their religious practice, and as they did this, they also authorized these practices with a divine model. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about where this expansion of the portrait of the Mother in Heaven, where this shows up in the community. How is this disseminated? How is this communicated? This collective portrait of the Mother in Heaven standing at the gates of mortality emerges most prominently in The Woman's Exponent. And this is a shot of this broadsheet publication. Edward L. Sloan, and Louisa Green started the periodical in 1872 with the sanction of Eliza R. Snow and Brigham Young, right? So it was sanctioned by the official structures of the church. Then, in 1877, this is probably the most important development in the history of the periodical, Emmeline B. Wells, she takes over as the owner and the editor of this journal, and she continues in that position until 1914, when the Relief Society magazine, do I have a portrait of that? Yes. The Relief Society magazine then becomes the official publication of the Relief Society. But we start with the Women's Exponent until 1914, with Emmeline B. Wells at the helm. And I love this picture because you can tell she was not messing around. I would not want to lock horns with Emmeline B. Wells. She's got a look in her eye. Right? And you can see how she, I'm reading a lot into this because I know her background, but she had the wherewithal to really make this a viable publication within her community. Wells' leadership allowed women writers individually and collectively to exercise agency in creating the portrait of the Mother in Heaven. So she's another really key figure here, like Snow. Like Snow, Wells held wide-ranging institutional leadership authority. So she was secretary of the Relief Society from 1888 to 1910, and she then became Relief Society president, like Snow, until her death in 1921. Wells also had many connections, like Snow, to the inner circle of male leadership. She was married 3 times, 2 times as a plural wife to really powerful men within the church. So her last husband was Daniel H. Wells, who was an apostle, which is sort of the second most powerful leaders within the LDS Church. He was also a counselor to Brigham Young, so he's very powerful. She was part of this younger generation of early women converts who, according to Beecher, were a second echelon of leading women who learned well from the older generation of leaders, such as Snow, about female self-rule. And here's another great photo. So this is of Eliza R. Snow, we recognize, and Emmeline B. Wells, but also Elizabeth Ann Whitney, who was one of this other first generation of kind of the inner circle, right? I love this picture because I think it illustrates well what Beecher was talking about, right? That the first generation is teaching that second generation of women leaders how to do it, basically. How do you gain and maintain an institutional presence? In her position as editor of the Exponent, Wells was instrumental in creating a lively literary dialogue among women of the church, a dialogue protected by Brigham Young's seal of approval for the Exponent, and again, by Wells' frequent public support of the male hierarchy within the periodical. So like Snow, she was very outspoken in her support of the priesthood. Wells aggressively encouraged women, and she was aggressive in this when you read the Exponent. She encouraged women to contribute to the periodical. She also really actively helped women authors to publish books on their own. So Emily Hill Woodmansey, whose poem we saw, who was an important poet, she was instrumental in getting her book published. Right? So she was really a motive force in getting women's work out there. Snow and Wells' institutional and charismatic agency made room for the collective agency of women. I see them as creating this kind of umbrella of opportunity for women. These women prophetically and individually clarified their understandings of the Mother in Heaven, with literary images available to them through Snow, and then communicated these understandings in the public literary forum provided by Wells as an appropriate place for dignified female discourse. So, again, if we think about those categories, these women writers were working within the structures of the church. Like, they were not trying to change them. But along the way, they collectively and unintentionally did. They created compelling theological discourse about the Mother in Heaven. They filled this lacuna that was there in the community. They took that prophetic opportunity that was offered to them and they ran with it. Yeah. So that's a quick roundup of how this figure of the Mother in Heaven, this understanding of her as standing at the gates of mortality, how this develops, how and why it develops. Now let's move on to the present day, and we're going to see that things change, and that women's agency within the church changes, and the way people talk about the Mother in Heaven changes, and we need to change our methodology accordingly. In the church today, women still have a strong presence within central institutional structures. So they oversee the Relief Society. They also oversee the Primary Association, which is the auxiliary for young kids. They also oversee the Young Women's Organization, which is an auxiliary for teenage girls. But they're less independent in their leadership than their sisters in faith 100 years ago. the nature of women's agency shifted for a number of reasons here. Citing a Weberian process of rationalization, historian Thomas Alexander shows that in the 20th century, church leaders attempted to bring all church auxiliaries and publications under the control of the central male leadership as they strove to create a unified, smoothly functioning, institution that would be accepted within wider American culture. And here, I'm guessing you probably know that Weberian idea that religions start with this, many Judeo-Christian religions start with this sort of prophetic, revelatory moment. Somebody like Joseph Smith introducing these new ideas. And it's really exciting, but it's also really chaotic, right? So in order for a group like Mormonism to continue, right, there has to be a systematization, a standardization, a rationalization is what Weber calls it, of the beliefs, the practices, the institutional structures, particularly the leadership succession, right? We have to be able to pass something on to the next generation. So Thomas Alexander says, in the late 19th century, especially after the church does away with the practice of polygamy in 1890, church leaders really self-consciously try to standardize the church so that they can make it a working institution, so that they can then pass it on to the next generation. And a lot of things happen as a result of this. Stuff is much more centralized, and so women's institutional presence shifts as a result of this. The Relief Society, we see this especially with the Relief Society. The Relief Society became very explicitly an auxiliary of the church, right? Not a parallel to the priesthood, an auxiliary. By the mid-20th century, the Relief Society no longer raised and used its own funds and no longer had its own publication. This centralization effectively prevented women leaders from building the kind of matriarchy within a patriarchy, that Snow and Wells and their contemporaries formed. Right? There wasn't that space available to them anymore. In addition, we have to think a little bit about the hymn itself, "Oh My Father." What happened to that? Still really, as Professor Campbell suggested, still really popular within the church, but it's not, from what I can tell, it's not as pervasive, right? So it's just everywhere in the sources that I was looking at. And it's not as authoritative as it was in the late 19th through the early 20th century. So it's not as frequently sung or referenced in the past. And really importantly, it's not identified as a revelation anymore, right? It's a cool hymn, but it's not seen as a revelation. So it's not as ubiquitous. It's not as authoritative. An example of this, in the 1985 edition of the official LDS hymn book, for instance, "Oh My Father" appears at the back of the hymn book as hymn number 292. And this is in contrast to this book on LDS hymns from the early 20th century that I looked at, where it's the first hymn, and there's extensive discussion about it and the history of it and the history of Eliza R. Snow. This is a really different presentation from that. I think you can see sort of the recession, in a way, of the hymn. Even more telling, it does not make the list of 18 hymns identified as well-known songs that are recommended for worship in state conferences or regional conferences of the church. Again, this is really different from the earlier context when, again, it's sort of a Lord's Prayer that's going to open everything from, word level to general authority. Yet, interestingly, the portrait that earlier women writers helped to develop remains in the way present-day church leaders talk about the Mother in Heaven, though in a more faint and diluted fashion. In the official church magazine Ensign, authors still speak about the Mother in Heaven in the context of longing for the divine home. So here's an example of this. This is Neil A. Maxwell, who was of the quorum of the 12 apostles. Again, the leadership level is just below the presidency. He was there he was an apostle from 1981 to 2004. And in this quote, we're going to see he places the responsibility on the Mother in Heaven for a happy heavenly homecoming that humans can anticipate. He, however, in this modern day context, he's the exception to the rule because he directly quotes Snow's hymn to describe the homecoming, and that's really unusual in the more modern context. He writes, "Finally remember, when we return to our real home," right, to the heavenly home, "it will be with the mutual approbation," so that's a direct quote, "of those who reign in the royal courts on high." Again, another direct quote. "There we will find beauty such as mortal eye hath not seen, and we will hear sounds of surpassing music which mortal ear hath not heard." And so here we get into more biblical language. "Could such a regal homecoming be possible without the anticipatory arrangements of a heavenly mother?" What's that? Totally, right? As in earlier depictions, the mother in heaven is a heavenly greeter. And for Maxwell, she becomes the consummate divine party planner. Yeah, Martha Stewart. When she does, so in this modern context, we don't see her show up as often, right? She's not as often a topic of conversation in these official publications. But when she does show up, she shows up in that same image that we saw that Snow Wells and these Mormon women writers collectively developed in the Exponent and then the Relief Society, and also in their more private writings. Right? She's standing at the gates of mortality. She's waiting to especially welcome you home. Right? She's what you can anticipate. Right? She's what you long for in mortality. Instead of exploring the vision of the mother in heaven in Snow's hymn, as earlier women authors did, and as Maxwell does above, in fact, most modern authors employ already published authoritative treatments of the mother in heaven. They thus demonstrate that the theological discourse of the church had become more standardized, right, as the church underwent this institutional regularization that I just talked about. It was outlined by Thomas Alexander. So, between 1979 and 2004 in Ensign, authors who refer to the Mother in Heaven quote Orson F. Whitney, who was a church leader in the late 19th century, who interestingly had a lot of close ties to that first and second echelon of women leaders. They quote him at least 6 times, 3 of those times coming in the years 1987 to 1989, and 3 of them quoting Whitney as quoted by late church president Spencer Kimball, who was in office from 1973 to 1985, right? So they're quoting a president who was quoting somebody else. So they're not riffing on this idea in the way that earlier women writers, right? They're looking to authority to speak about this figure. Now in this excerpt, Whitney this earlier church leader reflects on the meaning of suffering and trials, arguing that troubles had to be endured in order to make humans more like their divine parents. He does not describe God the Father or the Mother in Heaven beyond acknowledging their divinity. In church-sanctioned public discourse, the Heavenly Mother then has retreated somewhat back into the mystery and obscurity that earlier women writers were trying to illuminate. There's really a sense that these authors are stepping away from specific descriptions of the Mother in Heaven. But again, when those descriptions show up, they tend to echo these earlier women writers, with the premier characteristic of the Mother in Heaven being that she's standing at the gates of mortality, and she's sending her children off, and she's welcoming them back. But if we wanna figure out what's going on with women's agency, women's discussion of the Mother in Heaven today, we need to look beyond church publications in order to track how women are shaping public discussion of the Mother in Heaven in the present. Against the rationalizing backdrop of the church, and in response, I think, to the feminist movement and the more general mainstream interest in divine female figures in the 1970s and in the 1980s, church members began to write speculatively about the Mother in Heaven and began to speak about her and pray to her in church meetings. As did their foremothers in their church, right? They were engaging in a kind of imaginative theological discussion about the Mother in Heaven, or the Heavenly Mother. In the 1980s through the 1990s, the church leadership had a different reaction to this. They tried to cut off these discussions and these practices. Some prominent advocates of the Mother in Heaven, or scholars who wrote about the Mother in Heaven, were excommunicated, for instance. So in 1993, most famously, six people were excommunicated from the church. But this did not stop church members from speculating about the Mother in Heaven, as you'd guess. At the height of the Mother in Heaven controversy, LDS women and men publicly pondered the Mother in Heaven with great frequency, actually. Indeed, this attempted circumscription, seems to have encouraged members to come to grips with the Mother in Heaven in idiosyncratic and creative ways in extra church publications, such as Sunstone, Exponent 2, right? So this very self-conscious follow-up to the Woman's Exponent, and also Dialogue. So this just gives you a sense of almost like the vibrancy of these publications, right? That there's a lot of dialogue going on in these extra church publications. The colorfulness of it, I think, kind of expresses that. So I focus on dialogue. I looked at dialogue in particular. In dialogue during these years, so the 1980s, 1990s we're talking about, the portrait of the Mother in Heaven is much more varied and contested and even contradictory than the rather vague portrait that emerges in the Ensign during the same time period, and also much more contradictory than that earlier portrait. In one issue, Melody Munch Charles protests against the structures of Victorian sentimental motherhood through which her religious forebears strove to describe the Mother in Heaven. So she writes in a very critical way, Mother in Heaven can be nothing other than the faceless, nameless, unavailable for theological purposes blank that she currently is. She has no self apart from her husband. Right? So she has just this sense of disconnect with this figure. But just 2 issues later, another author goes back to these earlier domestic depictions and paints the Mother in Heaven as a caring mother embodied through the remembered experience of childhood. I don't have this quote up, but right, there's this sense that the experience of sort of embodied encounter here is really important, as it was in the earlier depictions. But against all official statements of LDS theology during the 1980s and the 1990s, these writers in dialogue most commonly interpret the Mother in Heaven as the Holy Ghost, and that's completely against Orthodox Mormon theology. Ruth Knight, frustrated by her failure at the bar exam, speculated on her need for the Mother in Heaven. So she writes, "What I needed was female power, Holy Ghost, Mother in Heaven, whatever it really was, inside power." Linda John expands on this idea. "I believe that it is she who plants the seeds of faith and desire in our hearts that leads us to Christ, and that we can find her living and waiting for us inside the church, filling it with her light and life." For these writers, the Mother in Heaven is the immediate and caring presence of God. In many ways, this conception contradicts the earlier image of the Mother in Heaven as removed and waiting in the spirit world, though caring and concerned about her spiritual children. So the Mother in Heaven, she's no longer a constant ritual presence, perhaps, as in the earlier days. But today, church leaders actively and imaginatively draw this goddess closer to themselves and their everyday concerns. And here, I think, again, you can see how, as in the earlier context, these women are using that kind of personal, prophetic, charismatic power to do this for themselves, right, in their own personal way, trying to figure this out in their own personal way. So, with no authoritative template, like the constantly present hymn, and standing outside the systematizing processes of the church, present-day authors offer no consensus about characteristics of the Mother in Heaven. This figure is open to individual prophetic interpretation as never before. Authors collectively create a vision that's fractured and contradictory compared to that earlier portrait of the Mother in Heaven. Yeah, so it's a really different, it's different agency, but it produces then a different understanding of the Mother in Heaven. All right, so just to conclude, and then I'll be really interested to have any questions or comments. Which, if any, of these extra-institutional depictions will take hold of the public imagination? Which will shape more official statements of the Heavenly Mother? Sociologist Armand L. Moss suggests that the central leadership has eased up on trying to control theological discourse about the Mother in Heaven. Lately, discussions of the Mother in Heaven have been taken up in blogs, which is not surprisingly, right? It's an even more individualized and informal form of public discourse. Perhaps this will create a still more fractured portrait of the Mother in Heaven. Perhaps it will do the opposite, though. The immediacy of the electronic realm may allow for communication of popular ideas across space. The lessening of church oversight might allow these ideas to take traction within the institutional discourse of the church. In the future, then, in order to track women's agency, we may very well need to again shift our focus to different models and methodologies in order to analyze how popular and institutional theological discourses about the Mother in Heaven disconnect. So here, again, I've used this Weberian framework, this Weberian model of interpretation, and also a lived religious model looking outside of the institutional structures. But in the future, these models might not work, or we might need to add other models or other methodologies to really fully capture women's agency and how they're shaping their communities. Women's agency is a moving target, right? It's not something that grows inevitably and in evolutionary fashion. And I think that this case study demonstrates that really well, that we need to move away from those kind of models. We need to think more holistically, more kind of open up our minds to really complicated relationships and complicated stuff that's going on. And I think that this speaks to, I just think that this speaks to larger issues within religious studies, that this shows that we really got to stay on our toes and think about how we think about religion, like what our definition of religion is. I know it's not cool to have a definition of religion in religious studies anymore, but right, how we think about religion, how we talk about religion, and therefore how we study it. Really basic questions. So that is all I have for you, and I'm happy to, I'm happy to take any questions or comments. Thanks for coming.